You might already be familiar with AAW Games. They're an independent publisher of fantasy roleplay supplements, focusing mainly on D&D and Pathfinder. They got their name by publishing an Adventure a Week, and they still do that at adventureaweek.com. But they did branch out into making these full-length hardback supplements as well. There's Rise of the Drow, which was, I think, received very well, been pretty successful. They published the Survivalist Guide to Spelunking, and now this, which I believe is their latest Kickstarter. It's called a Rultmoork, and this is an adventure for player characters levels, starting it from 5 to 7 and taking them to levels 8 to 11. So anywhere between 5 and 7 is a reasonable starting level, and you might end up anywhere between 8 and 11 by the end of the adventure because the difficulty is customizable, one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit. It is a complex and very lethal adventure. It's probably not for first-time DMs to run, probably not for first-time players to run through either.
I would totally agree with that.
It really rewards player cleverness and experience, I think. This is a really rewarding adventure for a very experienced dungeon crawl type player.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and it's got a hardcore mode too. Not only is it lethal the way it is, if you really want to go nuts, you can dial it up to the super hardcore mode.
Yeah, the hardcore mode was one of my favorite things reading this book. It takes a relatively difficult dungeon and makes it just insane, upping monsters, upping the strength of monsters, making traps more deadly. It just seems super fun.
Yeah, and well thought out, too. It doesn't feel like they slapped it on. Like, oh, if you want to make it harder, give 100 more hit points to the monster. There's actually cool suggestions for how to make it harder and more interesting.
Right, yeah.
A big thing that I liked about it, I found so refreshing, and I'm going to call it GM friendliness as a category. And what that means is when I read this, it's very clear to me that the authors have run countless games as game masters. They anticipate what you're going to need in a module. They give you everything you need at your fingertips. An example is that every section has a summary, a glanceable summary of what's in that section. So the whole section spells it out in your typical kind of wall of text adventure copy. But there's also a little pullout at the beginning that gives you the quick look at, here's the DC for this trap in this room, and there are 3 of this type of creature, and there's this treasure. And I don't know, if you're like me, when you're at the table, of course, you can't memorize all that stuff. And then the game bogs down as you flip through all these pages trying to find what was the DC for that one lock, or what was the what's the catch for that one trap. That summary in every section is, seems like it's easy enough to put in a book, but no one else I've ever seen has done that. I'm sure someone has, but I don't see it in the Wizards modules at all.
Another cool thing that I noticed reading this, not only do they give you the DCs and everything for everything, they also give you how much mundane things are worth.
Yes.
Or not necessarily a mundane thing, but you'll find certain things that normally wouldn't be worth anything in a campaign are actually worth gold to sell as their holy relics, or just important to the religion that is running this.
Right. An example is that if you make it out with one of the artifacts and you find the present worshipers of the god that this adventure revolves around, they value that. They'll give you whatever it was, 5 figures of gold pieces, I think.
Yeah.
That reminds me of just another general thing I liked a lot. It doesn't leave you scratching your head as a game master at all. Everything is spelled out, even like a magical lock or some kind of magical trap. It tells you what the school of magic is in the aura if someone does detect magic on it. That is the bane of my existence. I hate it. Honestly, I understand why players cast detect magic. They need to do that. But if it's a trap or it's something that isn't a spell, it is something that's magical but not a spell that I can look up in the book, I don't know. Now I got to make a call. Yeah, it's probably kind of obvious, but in practice, in a game when I'm running it and I got to sit back and think, well, wait, what's abjuration again? And what is it? Is this really... oh my God. That stuff is all spelled out.
As a player that often does this to his DM, it's actually really nice to actually... It sometimes bogs the game down when we're trying to figure out what that is, and having it laid out so clearly and just making it a non thing to just immediately oh, I have this information right here and ready to go.
Yeah.
It'll actually speed up the play of this game too.
Yeah. Yeah, they thought of almost everything that a GM needs to think about while they're on their feet running a game. Even the handouts are better than average. They're handouts for magical items. So, this isn't going to be in D&D Beyond because right now there are only a few third-party products in there. This is not a Wizards product. So I can't just go into my player's equipment and be like, oh, it's this, like in Ravenloft. Here, you found the holy symbol of Ravenkind. I can put it in your equipment and you can just read what it does. Or on Roll20, as a handout, sometimes you see these things. I've certainly rarely seen a printed product that has handouts for the magical items that are written for the player to consume that information as well. And, if you get the PDF, you can just print that page out and give it to them.
Yeah, no, it's awesome.
So even though we said it's not for new DMs, and that's strictly just because of the complexity, some of the traps in it are delightfully complicated in interesting ways, not needlessly so. It's not like someone's showing off their skill in geometry by forcing the characters to figure out what a hypotenuse is, or I don't even know that much about how that works.
It would be very difficult for a new DM to wrap their head around all the mechanics that they add to this system.
That's true, too. There are a lot of new mechanics that go along with the theme of it, which we'll talk about next. But in general, even though we're not recommending this for brand new DMs, nonetheless, it looks like it would make running the game a lot easier for experienced GMs. In fact, it removes all those little bookkeeping things and little calls you have to make, for example, about the colleges of magic.
Right.
It takes care of that for you, so you could just think about the complexity of the relationships, of the mechanics and the little traps and all the NPCs, all of whom are super interesting. I feel like it'd be a joy to run. I will find out because I do plan to run it. Another thing that I really liked about it a lot was the theme is really unique. It revolves around this idea of flow versus stagnation.
And duality in general.
Yes. Yeah, there's a yin and yang image in the back of it that shows the two colors for stagnation and flow. And they're both necessary. And there's this sort of theme about balance between them that's addressed in the adventure in a pretty subtle way. The balance is addressed pretty subtly. The whole thing about being caught in stagnation versus accepting flow and change, that's definitely in your face. But the idea of balancing them, it's almost like it's designed to make the characters find that and maybe think that they thought of it themselves, which is great. That's how I want players to feel.
Right.
The adventure should make them feel smart and capable, and I feel like it leaves room for that. I thought that was really cool. Not only that, the way they use the stagnation and flow themes, too. You can actually change the mode of a monster, one of the unique monsters that's in this book. There's a way that players can change them back and forth from flow and stagnation.
Yes.
There are ways that these flow and stagnation modes affect other things, physical things. Certain magical features of the dungeons respond to it as well, without wanting to give away what those are.
Yeah. So I'm trying to figure out how not to give away these special things.
Yeah. I would just say there are magic things or magic qualities of the dungeon that respond to it as well. And the characters kind of naturally discover what those are.
There's just so many cool things that were in this book that it's hard not to give away all the little secrets that you see just because there's just so cool.
Yeah. There's a very high coolness factor to all this stuff. And the way that the mechanics play off of it, it's very elegant. I found that very elegant. They actually do useful things. Right. They aren't just window dressing for the ideas of flow and stagnation. They directly affect.
They're integral to the entire play.
Yeah. The monsters respond to it. Magic items respond to it. Magic features of the dungeon respond to it. There are even new features for classes. There's a water domain for clerics and an oath of life water for a paladin. And again, they aren't just window dressing around the theme. The things that that school can do are very cool. The things that the Oath of Life Water Paladin can do are really cool.
Yeah, actually, there was already reading through those classes. I kind of already wanted to play one in a current campaign.
Okay. If it's one of mine, I'll allow it. We'll just put a water god into the setting.
Yeah, it's fine.
Their setting, so AAW does write, I think, mostly, if not entirely, within their own setting, and they have a water god, Vasi. And the other thing I wanted to mention that I noticed and liked a lot is dynamic styles of play. We already said that it's customizable in terms of difficulty. We mentioned the advanced mode that is there and really challenging. I will say that advanced mode isn't just punishing to the players either. It isn't just like that sort of sadomasochistic, Temple of Elemental Evil type of thing where it's just fun because it's hard. But it does reward player ingenuity. So it's very lethal. And in the advanced mode, super, super lethal. But there are things you can do as a player, if you're smart, if you're paying attention, if you pick up on clues, that will reduce how bad that difficulty really is.
And honestly, reading through it, it even gives a bunch of ideas that as a player I would come up with, and solutions for the DM already in those for certain traps. That I was like, oh, wow, they even thought that far ahead and gave those solutions already.
Yeah, in general, I think it's a very good balance between something that's challenging in a satisfying way, but also it awards player cleverness.
Yes.
It gives players agency. Like I said, it's not just punishing them, but it gives them an agency, I guess, to steal the paddle in that metaphor.
Yeah.
And punish the teacher. I don't know, this is starting to turn into a fetish channel, so I'm just going to move on to my next point. There's a whole section where players get to experience the backstory through the eyes of the characters that experienced that backstory. They're NPCs that are dead by the time this adventure begins. But instead of just hinting at the backstory, or how often have you done this, prepped a game with a really cool backstory and somehow the players never ask the right people about it or never get exposed to it and it's just a waste.
Right.
And, backstories don't have to be all fluff and pointless. In this game, they give a lot of clues as to how to solve certain problems, how to defeat certain monsters. Well, what happens here is the PCs experience this vision where they briefly take on playing the characters from history, and they directly see what happens. There's a little kind of mini game about what happens, and there really isn't supposed to be much combat in there. It can happen, but it's abstracted so that it doesn't get in the way. It's almost like a really reduced version of D&D or Pathfinder, whichever system you're playing.
And it's time travel without time travel.
Yeah.
Which is nice.
Yeah.
I actually really liked that they even use that as a way as a hook for your players. You can use that as a hook to bring your players to this adventure rather than playing it out throughout the adventure.
Yeah, which goes to that point of being dynamic.
Yeah, it's
everything in it is not only a little bit swappable, but they tell you intelligent ways to swap things out.
Yeah.
You could experience those visions. Your player characters could experience them at some point later in the adventure, or you could, like you said, use it as the hook.
Yeah.
You guys have this vision. You're drawn to this place. Rultmoork. And then it also has very interesting traps, and it has a way of bringing in puzzle-like play. We were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
That I'm not big on puzzles. I don't like them. My hyper little low working memory mind doesn't like to try to solve riddles, things like that.
Sometimes puzzles are very difficult without a physical medium to solve that puzzle.
Right.
That's what I run into.
Yeah, that's true too.
That being said, with there's a lot of cryptography in this game, and they give you the handouts and a way to work those solutions out physically, which is a really nice addition, like we were talking about with those handouts.
Yeah, very true. And not only that, the best thing from my point of view is that the puzzles aren't the only way to get whatever the puzzles give you access to.
Right, yeah.
They're there. So this is, again, a dynamic style of play. They're there, and they're available to players who will be drawn to that, but there are other ways to get around and solve problems.
There are other options. If you're playing with characters that don't necessarily like to do puzzle solving, then they give you ways around doing it.
The traps are super interesting, too. Some of the most complicated dungeon traps I have ever seen, but again, not in a bad way, in a really interesting way. I wish I could spoil the most interesting trap in the game, but I don't want to do that. If you're a GM, buy the book and be delighted by it. And if you're a player, get your GM to buy the book.
Right, yeah.
And you'll be delighted by it. The traps are cool. They reward, just like the puzzles, they reward different styles of play and different ways of dealing with them, whether it's disarming them or getting around them or using them to your advantage even.
Yeah.
You can use the traps to your advantage. And I don't just mean by trapping monsters with them.
Right,
interesting ways you can use them to your advantage. So I give it a thumbs up.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
This is not like a system we're doing. I just felt like doing this.
2 thumbs up, 4 thumbs up.
I don't know. Sure.
7 thumbs up.
I give it a natural 20.
Yeah.
No, I do. I really liked it. And I often give this caveat. We know that until we've played this on the table, this is a book review we're giving.
Right.
It's not really a full review until we've played it, right? Or a full opinion. I don't know that we're going to come back and do another review. But we don't really know what we think until we put it on the table. But, man, reading it and just having the experience of DMing and seeing some of those things it solves, I'm actually really excited about putting some sessions together to get through this.
It's definitely one that I would like to play through.
Yeah. And it's an entertaining read as well, even if you don't run it. If I have one critique, I would say it needed some editing love. I understand this is a small publisher, so I certainly don't expect it to be the kind of product that we would see from Wizards or one of the bigger publishers. But to be honest, it did have a few more typos and grammatical errors than I would expect from a production of this quality otherwise. It's well printed, it's well laid out, it has beautiful commissioned art in it.
Oh, yeah.
And it is very well designed, so it did trip me up a little bit to hit those points. But that's a really minor thing. I still think it's worth a purchase, and I would recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen very high quality books from Wizards that still have typos and things like that.
Sometimes, yeah.
So it's not crazy to think that you would miss a few, but I do agree there are a few grammatical mistakes that make it a little bit harder to read through.
Yeah, but not terrible.
But not terrible.
Not to the point that you don't understand it. Just to the point where you're like, oh, that's strange.
Worded a little weirdly.
Right. I don't know if they just didn't use a professional editor for this book, or whether it was one of those things where there's a tight timeline and there just wasn't time for line editing to that detailed of a degree. But hopefully that gets better.
Right.
Yeah.
And honestly, if that's the biggest issue we can find with this book, I'd say it's a pretty solid product to pick up.
Yeah, it's better than the average adventure that I read, even with the typos.
Right.
I'd still say this is well worth your money. And not too expensive. The price we see on the back of the book is $39.99. You get an idea of the thickness there.
Yeah. 164 pages, something along those lines?
Yeah. 144.
144.
And they give you these two. This was a nice touch. 2 ribbon bookmarks. One for flow and one for stagnation.
Yeah.
It's a nice little touch. That's it for Rultmoork. We will see you next time on the RPG Rundown.